United States. George Washington National Forest, 21st September 1993. Many believe that we are alone in the universe. However, one day something inexplicable happened. Something that forced us to ask ourselves, is this really true? It was September 1993. 2 months had passed since the end of summer, and for Mike and Tom, it hadn't been the best time. Both were in their mid-20s, living in a small town in western Pennsylvania, and although they'd been friends since high school, their lives hadn't been going according to plan lately. Mike worked at a local appliance factory, where he spent 8 hours a day assembling the same refrigerator parts. He felt as though each day at work drained his energy, leaving him with no motivation for anything else. By the time he returned to his small suburban apartment, all he wanted to do was sleep. Tom, on the other hand, had recently moved back home after a failed attempt at studying engineering. Too much work, family pressure, and then the sudden decision to quit. Everything overwhelmed him. He felt disappointed in himself. His parents weren't thrilled with his return, so he now worked part-time at a hardware store, trying to find a new direction in life. Both of them felt their daily routine was weighing them down. That's why Mike's idea to escape reality for a few days and go on a weekend survival trip seemed like the perfect solution. The forest had always been a source of calm for them. In the quiet and wild nature, they found the peace that was sorely lacking in their daily lives. They were also both passionate about survival. Since childhood, they'd spent hours camping, reading survival books and trying out various wilderness skills. They'd been on a few shorter trips before, but this time, they wanted to do something more challenging. Mike came up with the idea to head to the Appalachians, specifically to the area around George Washington National Forest, an enormous woodland full of hills and dense vegetation. It was the perfect spot, far from civilization, where there was no phone reception and no signs of other people. Tom quickly warmed to the idea. A survival trip seemed like the ideal way to clear their minds and forget about their problems. They had been planning the trip for weeks. Both of them pored over maps, checked weather forecasts, and analyzed the terrain. They had one goal: to spend 2 nights in the forest with minimal contact with the outside world, relying only on their survival skills and basic gear. They chose a location that was at least a 3-hour walk from the nearest town. That meant they wouldn't run into random tourists or have to worry about anyone bothering them. They opted for a particularly secluded area, a small clearing surrounded by hills, deep in the heart of the forest. They brought only the essentials: a tent, a few knives, food supplies for 2 days, flashlights, matches, ropes, and some canned goods. Mike, the more practical of the two, wanted to make sure they were well prepared. Tom, who had a more laid-back approach to life, packed a little less, counting on nature to provide everything they might need. Survival is the art of adaptation, not planning, he would say, though Mike always took those words with a grain of salt. The day of the trip finally arrived. Saturday morning greeted them with cool, damp air, typical for mountain regions in early autumn. Mike and Tom reached the parking lot on the edge of the forest, packed their backpacks, locked the car, and set off. The hike to their sower, or their chosen spot, took them a few hours, but it was exactly what they needed. The path led them through narrow, rocky trails, past small streams, deep into the dark, dense forest, where the trees seemed to grow closer together, as if trying to seal off the way back. Finally, they arrived at their destination, a small, secluded clearing surrounded by dense woods and hills. It was perfect. After setting up the tent and preparing a spot for the campfire, they sat on some stones they found around the clearing. Both were wearing thick jackets and warm hats. The nights in the mountains could be deceptively cold. As the sun slowly began to set, the temperature dropped significantly, but it didn't bother them. They ate a simple dinner, some canned food heated over the fire, washed down with water from a canteen. In the background, the ever-living forest buzzed, the hooting of owls, the rustling of leaves stirred by the wind, and the sounds of animals darting through the underbrush. "You know, man," Tom began, staring into the fire, I'm glad we came here. I needed this. These last few months have really weighed me down." Mike just nodded. The fire crackled softly, sending tiny sparks flying into the air. "I'm glad we're here together. Sometimes I feel more alive in this forest than I do at home," Mike added, looking at Tom. "That's true." Tom took a deep breath. No signal. No problems. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the nighttime sounds of nature. The forest was teeming with life, and they felt they had finally found a moment of peace. They were tired from the long hike, but also relaxed. They started planning what they'd do the next day. Maybe try to catch some fish in a nearby stream, or explore the surrounding hills. However, they had no idea that what would happen that night would change their lives forever. Around midnight, Mike and Tom woke up simultaneously, as if some invisible signal had pierced their dreams and yanked them back into reality. The tent was engulfed in complete silence. A deafening, unnatural silence. Tom's eyes shot open, trying to sharpen his hearing, but he heard nothing. No owls hooting, which had broken the monotony of the night just an hour earlier. There was no rustling of leaves, no sound of animals running in the distance. Not even the wind, which should have been stirring the tree branches in a gentle dance. This wasn't a normal silence. It was the thick, ominous kind that hangs in the air just before a storm, when everything freezes, waiting for something powerful to arrive. Tom turned his head toward Mike, whose face mirrored the same unease. He could feel it. Something wasn't right. Something unnatural. "Do you hear that?" Mike whispered, even though there was no real reason to speak quietly. In that silence, his voice sounded unnaturally loud, almost as if it was echoing off the walls of an invisible bubble surrounding the forest. Tom nodded, though he didn't hear anything. And that was the strangest part. The air around them had grown thick, swollen with something foreign, something he couldn't comprehend. Tom felt his heart begin to race, his hands trembling slightly. It seemed like time had slowed down, and every small movement took tremendous effort. Suddenly, from what felt like another dimension, a faint mechanical hum could be heard in the distance. At first, barely noticeable, but with each passing second, it grew louder, becoming more distinct. It wasn't the sound of any machine they knew. It was metallic, monotonous, yet had something alien, unnatural about it. The sound drilled into their minds, stirring fear and an unnamed anxiety. "What the hell is that?" Tom, trying to stay calm, grabbed a flashlight as if that simple, familiar object could somehow protect him from the unknown. But his hand was shaking slightly, and his heart was pounding harder, as if warning him of the approaching danger. Mike, who had been staring into the darkness, finally peeked out through the tent's entrance, slowly unzipping it, as if afraid that a sudden move would invite some kind of threat. When his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something that made him freeze in place. Above the trees, where moments earlier there had only been darkness, a faint glow had appeared. The light was bright, cold, almost like moonlight, but far more intense and steady. It didn't flicker or pulse. Cold, bluish-white beams pierced through the treetops, illuminating them in an unnatural way. Everything around seemed bathed in that light. It was too strong to be coming from any flashlight or even a spotlight. It looked as though the entire space around them was illuminated by something not of this world. "Mike, what is that?" Tom whispered, but his voice broke halfway through, as if he himself couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mike didn't respond immediately. He lowered the tent's zipper and watched as the light slowly moved toward them. It seemed like its source was just above the trees, moving silently, as if gliding across the sky. It was intense but not blinding, almost hypnotic, as if inviting them to leave the tent and come closer. For a moment, Mike felt like he couldn't move. His legs refused to obey him, as if they had been rooted to the ground. Suddenly, everything around them began to tremble. At first, gently, barely noticeable, but with each passing second, the vibrations grew stronger. The trees rustled. Branches began to sway as if the wind wanted to snap them, but there was no wind. The air stood still, unnaturally calm. The tent they sat in shook violently, and the ground beneath them vibrated as if something unimaginably powerful was moving beneath it. Mike tried to say something, but his voice died in his throat. He opened his mouth, but instead of words, only a soft, helpless moan escaped. Tom looked at him with wide eyes, his face pale as paper. Mike felt fear starting to take control of him. He tried to regain control of his body, but nothing worked. His heart was pounding like a hammer, and his breathing became shallow and rapid, as if something was crushing his chest. And then they saw them. For a moment, it seemed to them that the light above had thickened, as if it had taken shape. Slowly, with unnatural fluidity, a structure emerged from the trees and hovered over the clearing where they stood. It was a massive, round shape. It resembled something like a flying saucer, but its surface seemed to pulse as if it had a life of its own. The metallic, silvery surface reflected the few rays of light that filtered through the thick trees, but the main glow emanated from the machine itself. The light flooded everything around. Mike felt as if it surrounded him from all sides. His body seemed weightless, as if he had suddenly become part of this strange glow. His head throbbed with unbearable pain, and dark spots flickered before his eyes. He started to feel dizzy, as if everything around him was spinning in a strange, uncontrolled dance. Tom, beside him, looked the same. His body trembled slightly, as if no longer under his control. Suddenly, the sounds returned, as if something had torn the world out of that terrifying bubble of silence. But the sounds were different. They were low, vibrating tones that pierced through them. They didn't hear them with their ears, but inside their heads. The vibrations were so strong that they felt them in their bones, in the very center of their bodies. It was like resonance, as if their bodies had been tuned to an alien frequency. The light finally froze and then began to expand. Then they saw something that made their blood freeze in their veins. Tom and Mike stared at each other, dazed, shocked, their hearts pounding in pure panic. In the blink of an eye, their entire sense of reality was turned upside down. The metallic structure that had suddenly appeared before them was like something pulled from their deepest nightmares and strangest dreams. At first glance, it resembled a flying saucer, but not the kind one would expect from science fiction stories. It was a complex, inhuman creation, almost organic, as if each part of it had its own life. The surface of the object flickered, changing colors from cold silver to shades of blue, as if this being, for it was more than a machine, was breathing, pulsing with energy. The light that illuminated the clearing began to thicken. Its cold glow increasingly surrounded Mike and Tom, as if suspending them between sleep and wakefulness. His body, though physically capable of movement, was paralyzed by some invisible force. They were prisoners in their own bodies, and all they could do was watch. One of the beings, the one closest to Mike, raised a hand that looked more like a long, slender limb than a human hand. At that moment, Mike felt something invading his mind. It wasn't a physical force. It was a pressure on his thoughts, as if something or someone was flipping through the pages of his memories, searching for something. His memories flashed before his eyes at a dizzying speed. Childhood, first loves, hard times, joys. All were ruthlessly searched by this alien mind that showed no mercy or understanding. Tom also stood motionless, his face white as a wall, his eyes wide open, staring at one of the beings that glided toward him. Despite the paralysis, Mike could clearly feel his friend's emotions, pure, inhuman panic. Tom was trying to fight what was happening in his head, but he looked completely defeated by these forces. Suddenly, without any warning, the beings turned and began to move away, as if their task had been completed. The light, which had previously seemed like an almost physical barrier, began to slowly fade. Their bodies, which had earlier seemed so strongly controlled by an unknown force, suddenly regained their natural weight. Mike could move his arms again, though his movements were slow, as if just waking from a deep sleep. He felt his heart begin to beat normally, and his breathing became regular. Tom beside him also moved, but his face was frozen in an expression of pure shock. "What the hell was that?" Mike finally blurted out, his voice trembling, as if he couldn't control his emotions. But before Tom could respond, something even stranger happened. The ship hovering over the clearing began to slowly rise into the air, emitting a soft but distinct hum. They watched as its metallic surface glimmered in the moonlight, and then, in an instant, it vanished. It simply disappeared. There was no flash, no noise, as if it had never been there. And suddenly, everything returned to normal. It was as if the reality around them reverted to its original state. The sounds of the forest, which had previously faded away, suddenly filled the space. They heard owls, the rustle of leaves, the sounds of animals, as if the night had become natural again. But for them, this night was never meant to be normal again. When they woke up in the tent the next day, sunlight was filtering through the dense forest canopy, creating patches of light on the leaf-covered ground. Mike struggled to open his eyes, feeling the throbbing pain in his temples. The previous night was still fresh in his memory, though muted by the sun that seemed to promise normalcy. Tom, lying next to him, also appeared tired, his expression revealing that the night had not been enjoyable for him. "It had to be a dream, right?" Tom asked, staring at the tent ceiling as if he could find the answer there. Mike nodded, although there was no conviction in his heart. The eerie silence, the glow surrounding them, and those beings. Everything felt so real yet so impossible. They couldn't comprehend why their minds, so well acquainted with the forest and its sounds, could conjure something so inhuman. Every attempt to rationalize this experience felt like a struggle against a shadow, elusive and terrifying. Tom tried to seek rational explanations, but each of his considerations seemed more absurd than the last. Maybe it was a hallucination caused by fatigue, lack of sleep, or something they got from canned food. It was a weekend in the woods, an adventure among men, but it shouldn't have ended with such strange phenomena. Mike disagreed. He knew that what they had experienced was not a hallucination. He felt that one couldn't simply invent something as real as what had happened to them. Overwhelmed by anxiety, Mike avoided sleeping for the rest of the day. Instead, they decided to spend time fishing in the nearby stream. The sound of water, though soothing, couldn't neutralize the rising fear that lingered in their minds. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, awakened their unease. They glanced at each other, trying to convince themselves that it was just their imagination, but the bond of their shared experience created a tension that couldn't be released. When they returned to town, they decided not to tell anyone. The fear of rejection, of misunderstanding, and above all the fear of being considered crazy, paralyzed them. Even among themselves, they talked about it less and less. When Mike heard Tom sigh while mentioning a new car, he soon noticed a change in topic. A subject that should have been simple and carefree was overshadowed by mysteries that extended beyond their understanding. However, despite their earnest attempts to ignore the events of the night, their minds wouldn't allow them to forget. Every night, as Mike fell asleep, he saw before his eyes the terrifying cold light that had dominated their reality. It was like a window to another world that had opened in his mind. Every moment he closed his eyes was filled with visions of those unnatural figures that had so easily invaded his mind. At night, his heart raced at the sound of whispers. The horrifying sensation of being watched never left him. Whenever he closed his eyes, he felt as if he were becoming part of something larger, something that could use him. Time passed, and Mike and Tom grew increasingly uncertain. The streets of the town, once familiar and comfortable, had become sources of anxiety. The society they lived in was full of ordinary people, but in their minds, a new fear had emerged, a fear of the unknown. The unknown that could be anywhere, hiding behind every plant, every tree, every person. Mike knew they had to do something about it. They had to find out what really happened in the woods. But with every moment, with every step toward the truth, their determination waned. And so, they both lived in fear, trapped in a cage of their memories that could explode anew at any moment. Don't be afraid to speak the truth. If you have your own story, experiences, or evidence related to UFOs, please email us. Your story is important and can help others who have had similar experiences. UFO X-Files connects us. You are not alone.